different strands. One was about the story of Pakistan Railways, the company, which unfortunately has been in a fairly accelerating state of decline in recent years, which is very sad because, of course, much like Indian Railways, this very proud tradition spanned the country. And in recent years, in line with a lot of, I saw it as a sort of a metaphor for the crumbling authority of the state. More frequently we hear about the electricity shortages in Pakistan. There's a very grave energy crisis. Even some of the other state companies like Pakistan Airways have been having a lot of difficulties recently. But I decided to focus on the trains. And the other purpose of this journey really was to sort of take a look at the country, from the perspective of the people who use the railways. And like you say, there were several things that came out of that. One was indeed this issue about the military. I mean, what was interesting for me really was that we stopped in Lahore and we went to this place called the Royal Palm, which is this very swanky golf club, country club. It's got a bunch of wedding halls in the middle of Lahore. It's built on former railways land. And there had been a very controversial deal some years ago during the Musharraf era where the control of the land was passed from the Railways Club to this private enterprise for this club. And all of this had been transacted under a former Director General of the ISI who had become the Railways Minister under Musharraf. And anyway, there was a lot of controversy about that. It's still in the courts in Pakistan. It's still in the Supreme Court. That general has come under scrutiny. And I think in a way, actually, that points to one of the more positive developments in Pakistan in recent years, which is that the military has been challenged in a quite unprecedented way, actually, in the courts. There have been the probes, for instance, into this corruption. We've had former army chiefs, former ISI chiefs who've been brought before the courts and asked to account for election rigging in the 1990s. And of course now we have the absolutely astonishing spectacle in many ways of Pervez Musharraf, former military ruler, a man who enjoyed absolute supreme authority in Pakistan for, 9 years, now incarcerated in his own home in a farmhouse on the edge of Islamabad, facing criminal prosecution in 4 cases and potential treason charges, or rather treason charges with a potential death penalty in 1 more. And I think, for all of the things that haven't changed in Pakistan, this is actually, I think it's important to say, also a time of considerable change in other respects. And I think for me, that's part of the sort of fascination of the place.
That's very true, very interesting as well. And it actually brings me to something that emerged from reading Atish's work on Pakistan. A lot of your work in Noon deals with a sort of emerging upper middle class, which is not necessarily feudal in nature. It's sort of mercantile in origin, but it's a very small and very threatened or very fragile sort of group. So it's interesting, especially because you've also written about feudalism in Pakistan. You wrote about the Mango King, and so you've had an insight into both those sections of Pakistani society. Can you tell us a little bit about the difficulty or the ease about writing on both those sections of Pakistani society?
So you're right, they're not strictly feudal, but what has happened, and I think that it's become like a kind of, the elite has taken on the character of feudalism. So my family certainly was not a feudal family, but you'd often hear that people would behave in feudal ways, which was usually like a kind of byword for bad behavior. But there was, I saw in this class a level of deracination, a kind of distance from the country, a very alarming, I've never come across a class that sat at such a remove from the country. And obviously when you would travel in the country and you would see such dangerous or toxic forces, and then you would come into a drawing room and see the most isolated people in the world, you couldn't help but feel a kind of fear for them. So there was that element, and that was in that that noon in that last section that you're referring to, it's called Port Bin Qasim in Idil, and Port Bin Qasim is a town of my imagination modeled on Karachi. And what it was about was how the country, despite all the protections of this class, how that country would still intrude on their lives. And Declan was saying a moment ago that there are many Pakistans, and you can't fall into this binary of saying, oh, this is the bad side, this is the good side. And that's very true. Like there are sort of, as Naipaul says in the beginning of that Beyond Belief introduction, you know, the train has many carriages, but it's passing through the same country. And I felt very much in this world as well, an experience with some kind of larger narrative that the country was going through. And perhaps most simply, I would say that it was an experience with violence. And often when we're talking about jihadi violence, we fall into thinking of something very organized, like there's going to be an Islamic revolution, that there's going to be these Taliban-like force that will come to power, and it's not like as if that's something irrelevant, but it doesn't tell the whole story, because there's an experience of violence in that country with robbery, with kidnappings, with domestic violence that speaks much more powerfully of social decay than something as simple as jihadi violence.
That's quite interesting, and it actually brings me to something I wanted to ask Mr. Parthasarathi about. The concept of violence, or the description of violence, is ever present in Atish's writing. I wanted to ask you, you've seen Pakistan in a world before 9/11 and in a world after 9/11. Has, the sort of dynamics of violence, have they changed since then? Have they intensified? Has violence itself evolved in Pakistan since 9/11?
I look at violence in Pakistan in two different manifestations. One is, I think, since the day it was born, they've not been able to define a sense of national identity. Even we had a problem in defining ourselves, but 60 years on, with our messy democracy, with people moving around, I guess we've been able to find our equation as Indians. I mean, I can be a Tamil, I can love Tamil literature, I can study in a Christian missionary school, and I can be a Hindu, and yet have my best friend as perhaps a guy who's in a Catholic missionary school, a Christian from the north, or a Muslim from the north, or whatever. I mean, for us, we have learned that to be a country, it's good to cherish diversity. That's important. Now, I think in the case of Pakistan, because they wanted to be something which is not India, they've run into a problem. Mr. Jinnah asked for a country because he said Muslims are a separate nation. On 11th of August, he delivers a speech where he says, in the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, it does not matter if you are Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, that is your personal business. You are all citizens of Pakistan. If that was the case, Mr. Jinnah, why did you want a separate nation for Pakistan, for Muslims? And in any case, they found themselves confronted with as many Muslims in India as there were in any part. Finally, I think the crushing blow of religion alone being a basis of nationhood ended with Bangladesh. Because the creation of Bangladesh destroyed the myth that religion alone can be a basis of nationhood. And therefore, you run into this problem in Pakistan that people know that if you're a Baluch or a Sindhi, you have a culture, a history which is different from that of the Punjabi or the Pashtun. But it is regarded as not correct politics to define yourself in those terms. And if you define yourself purely in terms of Islam or in terms of a religion, then you run into confusion because more people embracing the Islamic faith have died in Shia-Sunni clashes in Pakistan than have ever died in communal clashes in India. So defining yourself and thinking that unity lies in uniformity is a fundamental mistake in my view. I remember a former Director General of the ISI, when he said something about Indian Muslims, and I told him, if I may speak in Hindi, कि जनरल साहब आप ये समझते नहीं हैं कि हिंदुस्तान में ये फ़र्क हम देखते नहीं हैं कि आप हिंदू हो या मुसलमान. He had a very interesting answer to me. He said, सफ़ीर साहब, आपका ताल्लुक मद्रास से है, दक्कन से है, हम आपको हिंदुस्तानी नहीं समझते. Now, meaning his concept of India ended with the Deccan Plateau. This concept that you could be diverse, that Mr. Chidambaram can walk in with his South Indian dhoti to Parliament or to the Rashtrapati Bhavan and feel quite comfortable and nobody else feel uncomfortable, is quite different from insisting on a shalwar kameez as being the sole attire you will wear when you are so diverse. So I think this question of defining national identity is going to become a problem. And to my mind, since the society is so heavily weaponized, as I said, you can buy in Peshawar an AK-47 for the equivalent of about 12 to 15,000 Pakistani rupees. It's quite easily available. Now, in a weaponized society, when you have the military funding radical Islamic groups to create problems in two of your neighbors, Afghanistan, which is the Taliban, and India, which is the likes of the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, then these very groups, because of their sectarian differences, turn against the state, turn against each other. Providing that extent of weaponization, and this is largely run by the army, is a bad idea. It affects the thought processes, the perspectives of youth, and that is really the serious problem which Pakistan faces. Radical, Wahhabi, Salafi-oriented beliefs coming in with Saudi money, supported by the state apparatus, against people, I would say, on the road, largely wanting to go about their daily lives. And Pakistan's problems, to my mind, are going to come from this dichotomy. And I would, again, to an audience like this, just all ask us to remember that our strength is our religious, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. Let's learn to respect it.
I think it's quite interesting that you speak about diversity and the pressure on the concept of diversity that is in Pakistan. What is also very interesting is that despite all these pulls and pushes, we see quite a range of very good writing coming out of Pakistan. We've got fantastic authors, fantastic commentators coming out of Pakistan who are actually very, very brave and who have painted very vibrant portraits of their societies. Perhaps, Atish and Declan, I mean, if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the writing that's emerging from Pakistan, the sort of flavors that, this is characteristic of. That would be quite interesting.
I just want to just to respond to one thing that Mr. Parthasarathi said about this business of religion as a foundation or as a glue for the state. What I would add to that was that a lot of that a kind of dialectic sort of sometimes falls into place in Pakistan, where because of the way the faith works, because there's often, like every country will encounter problems, but there's a kind of flawed leap of logic that you can often make in a nation founded on faith, which is that you say, if only we were better Muslims, everything would be okay. And it sets up, in my opinion, a situation where the polity has to always be cleansed of some form of unbelief. And in 1947, it was very clear that this state that was founded could not have Sikhs and Hindus in it, that they would have to go for the state for it to realize its aims. And what, in the last 15 or 20 years, what's in my opinion, is that the most frightening part is that no purity is pure enough. So Shias are not pure, Ahmadis are not pure, people who practice the Indic Islam of Pakistan, they're not pure. And so it becomes like a kind of ever-shrinking circle, in my opinion, where there's always some call for a higher purity, and that enemies are essential. You always have to find someone whose belief is flawed. That is the response. On the front of writing, I think it's wonderful. I will say that in some ways, and we can't ignore this fact, is that it's not a literature that has, and we've seen in Pakistan before, with a poet like my great uncle Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and my grandfather to some extent, there was a literature which had an incredible basis in the soil of Pakistan. The writing that's coming out of Pakistan is absolutely first rate, but it is like an emigre literature. Certainly Declan will tell you that probably, like if you wander the streets of Lahore, no one has heard of these writers, you know? So I would say that not to say anything against the writing, because I think that it is a very volatile time. And beyond writing, in painting, in music, there seems to be like an incredible energy in people in some ways, like responding to the difficulties of working as artists in Pakistan. But is this literature going to transform the state of Pakistan? I think probably not.
Are you saying this is drawing room artistry?
I'm saying that it's limited to a happy few.
Declan, would you agree?
I think the place of great literature is to reflect what happens in society. And a lot of the books that we're seeing out of Pakistan these days, you look at Mohsin Hamid's recent book, How to Grow Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, and so on. You know, these books, I think, are gaining a very wide audience. I certainly take Athish's point that within Pakistan, largely actually because they're written in English, I think they have quite a limited audience. But internationally, these books are tapping into both a sort of a curiosity about Pakistan, but also they're tapping into much broader themes about globalization in many cases and so on, and they're reaching very wide audiences. And actually, I was in Lahore in February, I guess, for the Literature Festival there. It was the first one. So, you know, I think perhaps a little bit like India, started in Jaipur, and now you have so many literature festivals. In Pakistan, they are spreading like wildfire as well. It started with Karachi. Now there's Lahore. I think there's one or two in Islamabad this year. And, you know, particularly in Lahore, I was so struck by, you know, the huge crowds that came, the sort of rapturous welcome that was given, particularly to Mohsin Hamid, who was like sort of the local boy who'd made good abroad and came home. He had this sort of rock star welcome that was incredible. And it really just showed that there is, you know, not just, and there isn't just people who are producing great literature that is born of the adversity of the country in many cases, and often of the difficult questions that it faces. But also, I think there is a great appetite for Pakistanis to hear their own stories and to discuss